Thank you for tuning in to Chrontendo episode 13, and we're going to pick up right where we left off last time, in the middle of the Japanese holiday season, which is a busy time for video game manufacturers. Now, something we're going to see this episode that we haven't seen too much of for the Famicom is a sports game. There is a baseball game coming up, and it's only actually the second baseball game released for the system, the first being Nintendo's Baseball. Came out way back when. Nintendo had released a few sports games, tennis, soccer, golf, baseball, and more recently they released volleyball. Irem released a football game, but other than that there haven't really been many sports titles for the Famicom. So starting about right now, we're going to see a sudden pickup in the number of sports games coming out. So over the next couple of years for the Famicom, brace yourself for an unusually large number of golf games. Well, there's something different right there. This is Gall Force, Eternal Story, and this is based on the 1986 animated feature film, the first in a series of several movies. The plot was concerning a race of all-female solnoids battling an evil alien race called the Paranoids. Sounds like this was written by L. Ron Hubbard or something. And this is the first game to be published by HAL. They'd previously developed some titles, but this is their first game as a publisher. They'd later go on to fame and fortune with such games as the Kirby series and Super Smash Bros. And here you'll see a pretty elaborate introduction sequence here that shows you all the characters. Now this is disturbing. That character is supposed to be only 10 years old. I guess we've just seen the introduction of Lolicon into console video games. Video game culture definitely takes a turn for the worse right here. Thanks a lot, Hal. So definitely Gall Force has some pretty nice production values. Once the game itself actually loads, you'll see that you're playing pretty much a standard looking shoot 'em up. You only have one fire button that'll hit things that are both in the air and things on the ground. And in this game you have some sort of invisible life bar. You can take a number of hits before dying. Well, actually the first thing that will happen is one of your engines will come off, then the second one, and finally once you're just to the main body, you'll then lose a life. Now once you've gotten to the first part of the level here, you'll eventually come to these little tubes that look, I guess, some sort of thing that'll launch you into outer space. You select one of these, depending on which level you want to go to. It'll actually repair your ship, and then shoot you off into some sort of a space station. Now up to this point, Gall Force seemed like a pretty decent shooter. It's really around this level right here where things start to break down. As you notice, the graphics look pretty good and the environments are actually very detailed. And it's really to HAL's credit they were actually able to put this much stuff on the screen at once without having massive amounts of flicker. But the problem here is that there really are a lot of enemies and a lot of bullets. In fact, you can barely see the bullets against a very busy background. There's simply too much stuff going on here. This level might be okay if there was a plain black background, but as it is, you really can't see what's going on. There are just tons of cannons on the ground firing a constant barrage of shots at you, and enemy fighters come in from all directions, and it's really, you're going to get hit a lot of times simply because it's very difficult to concentrate on what's going on. And the fact that the enemy ships move a lot faster than you, your ship is very slow, doesn't make this game any easier. Now once you get to the actual boss, you'll probably be a little disappointed. This guy looks pretty good. He's certainly decent sized, even if he's a little silly looking with those weird eyeball-like things. However, he does sort of fire the same sort of group of shots over and over again in a pretty simple pattern. It's very easy to dodge, but he takes a lot of hits to blow up. I've actually edited out the vast majority of this boss fight, but actually doing this is incredibly tedious. You've simply got to dodge, get a few shots in, and then repeat over and over again. This boss fight is really more of an endurance match than an actual challenge. Once you've blown this guy up, another character will join your team. Once you have multiple team members, you can actually switch between them, but this doesn't actually change your ship, and there doesn't really seem to be much point to it. Now that you've completed level 1, you'll move on to the next level, fly over the planet's surface again, then go back into outer space, and then you'll face another long, dull boss fight. And really, one of the major failings of this game is that there doesn't seem to be much in the way of power-ups. Each character has some sort of special ability. Like, for example, with one character you can get a little helper ship that comes in. But these really aren't very useful. For example, the helper ship disappears quite quickly. Maybe later characters are much better, but it seems that for most of the game you'll be playing with just your regular laser cannon. Maybe if you had better power-ups, this game might be a bit more playable. But as a rule, you're completely underpowered, way too slow, and completely bombarded by enemies. Especially on the space station levels, I found myself getting hit tons of times. Zanuck certainly proved that a shooter could put lots of enemies on the screen and be very challenging, but still be fun at the same time. This game is not nearly as well balanced as Zanuck. It's quite possible there are some aspects of this game that I simply failed to grasp. However, to me, this game certainly appears to be a technically very well done, but almost entirely unplayable shoot-'em-up. HAL Laboratories would, of course, go on to make better games in the future. We certainly have some very odd games this episode, but nothing nearly as weird as Namco's Takeshi no Chousenjou, or Takeshi's Challenge. Who is Takeshi? Well, he's none other than Takeshi Beat Kitano, the Japanese comedian and TV personality who was quite well known in Japan in the mid-80s. He had several TV shows, including the rather bizarre game show Takeshi's Castle. He didn't really break through in the West until the 90s, where he's more known as not as a comedian, but as a serious actor and director of gritty, stylized crime dramas like Violent Cop and Sonatine. I like that chart we just saw in the background there. I guess things aren't going too well. Takeshi no Chousenjou is really unlike any game ever made, and was deliberately designed to be unplayable, probably as some sort of a statement about video games. In Japan, this is considered to be a prime example of kusoga, or a shitty game, but it actually has sort of a cult following due to its almost avant-garde nature. In the game, you play a typical Japanese white-collar worker who leaves his job and goes off in search of some sort of hidden treasure in an exotic locale. The game begins with you simply wandering around on the streets, and you can beat up anybody that you want to. If nothing else, the game has a rather entertaining jumping animation and amusing little graphics of you pounding the other guys into mush. However, in order to actually make any progress in the game, you'll need to go into this one bar and sing this karaoke song repeatedly for 1 hour. Remember that the Famicom controller has a microphone built into it. If you actually manage to get through this, you'll apparently be required to hold down a button while the screen goes blank for around 4 hours. It's unlikely many folks will be able to make it through this, but if you do, apparently what happens is you fly off to some remote island, experience a very bad horizontal flying level, do some platformings to the island and the native villages, and eventually enter a temple to face the final boss. Reportedly, you have to defeat this boss by hitting a button on your controller 20,000 times in a row. After that, the game ends. However, if you yourself play, you'll probably spend all your time simply wandering around the streets, beating up the little Yakuza guys. The only people who actually attack you are the, well, I assume they're Yakuza, the green-haired guys, or occasionally the cops. At one point you can enter a pachinko parlor and play a really silly little pachinko minigame, but I certainly wouldn't advise you play the game with the intent to get through it. Now, technically this game looks pretty wretched. Certainly the graphics aren't very appealing looking. And all the fighting is very boring. You simply battle someone by hitting your button and striking him over and over and over again while he does the same to you. While in theory this game was designed by Beat Kitano himself, I'm not really sure who actually developed this game. This does seem sort of below the standards of Namco's usual work. For example, there's a pretty notorious glitch in the game where you can enter one level where everything is completely screwed up. Though of course I suppose it's possible this could have been done on purpose. So what do we think about this game? Well, I don't know, it's really more of an experiment than a real game. I guess it's an interesting idea, but not the kind of thing you actually want to sit down and play. From Taito's long-standing competitor Namco, we have a game that is about as different from Takeshi no Chousenjou as a game can be. Pro Yakyuu Family Stadium. Yakyuu is baseball, and this is only the second baseball game for the Famicom after Nintendo's own early title, Baseball. However, Pro Yakyuu is significantly different from the earlier baseball games in that it uses real-life players. The teams are clearly based on actual Japanese baseball teams, such as the Yomiuri Giants, the Yokohama Bay Stars, and the Hanshin Tigers, and features such well-known players as Sadaharu Oh. This is actually the first game in Namco's Family Stadium series, or the Famista series as it's often called in Japan. Namco is still releasing Famista games to this very day. So you choose your team, pick your starting pitcher, and begin the game. Family Stadium plays much like the earlier Nintendo game. You move your player around and swing the bat. Just like real baseball, hitting the ball with a bat's sweet spot tends to yield better results. I myself, though, tend to get a lot of fouls and pop flies. And occasionally you'll get lucky and get a home run. Now once your player has hit the ball, you can use your D-pad and buttons to control your runner, whether you want him to advance to a base, go back, so on and so forth. Now the huge gameplay advance in Family Stadium is that every player has his own individual stats for hitting and pitching. Thus, every team is different. Some players are power hitters and are more likely to hit home runs. Some pitchers can throw faster than others. Knowing your team's capabilities is essential to mastering the game. Family Baseball has a certain strategic element that a lot of earlier baseball games, like the Nintendo title, were missing. One thing that's a little annoying and difficult about this game is fielding. I myself find it pretty hard to determine where the ball is going to land. You can't actually see it while it's up on the air, so you sort of have to guess where to put your guy. If Family Stadium looks familiar to you, it's because it was released in the US by Tengen as RBI Baseball. A lot of Namco's games were actually released by Tengen, and Tengen of course was the subdivision of Atari that released NES titles. RBI Baseball used American teams and players and was released sometime in early 1988. Now the actual team names could not be used, but since Tengen had the MLBPA license, the actual players' names could be used, just like in the Japanese version, and the stats were based on the real players' stats. As it turns out, RBI Baseball became one of the most highly thought of sports games for the NES, and still has a pretty big following to this day. One thing that was changed, obviously, was the team's colors. And that guy's a pretty fast pitcher. Well, at least he's pretty good at striking me out. And once again, I get another foul. Now, regardless of the qualities RBI Baseball has as a game, it did mark a pretty major turning point in sports games, away from games featuring generic teams and players, and more towards games based on actual sports leagues and real players. Today, of course, a lot of the popular sports franchises are all pretty much, licensed by the NFL or Major League Baseball and so on and so forth. Back at this time, that really was pretty uncommon, which is sort of what made RBI Baseball so much different. For better or worse, Family Stadium / RBI Baseball was one of the games that started the trend in complexity and stats and so-called realism in sports games. Here we come to Sherlock Holmes, Hakushaku, Reijou, Yuukai, Jiken. This is a very strange little game that is almost unknown today. The subtitle translates roughly into The Kidnapping of the Count's Daughter, which is exactly what we saw occurring during the title screen. This game involves the disappearance of Margaret, daughter of a British count. You, Sherlock Holmes, dressed in your traditional lime green overcoat and deerstalker hat, must find her. Now, being the world's greatest detective, you think that you would use your sleuthing skills to find the missing woman, but no, instead you hit the streets Grand Theft Auto style, killing random pedestrians with your kung fu kick and stealing their cash. The main overworld has a Ganbara Goemon-like three-quarters view of town, but you can enter various buildings, parks, and sewer systems. Once inside, you'll switch to the traditional side view. Oddly, the next game we're going to see, Doreamon, uses a very similar system. Another odd thing, once you're inside, Holmes's wardrobe inexplicably changes from green to purple. One rather annoying thing about this game, whenever you hit someone inside of a building, they'll say something. You'll need to hit both your A and your B button to close this screen and return back to the normal game. Once you've found the magnifying glass, you'll need to search around for clues. Right now I was examining a crack in the wall, and it gave me a little clue. Well, like Zelda, most of these clues aren't particularly helpful. I mentioned a certain similarity to Ganbara Goemon, but the game world is much smaller in this game. I think there's only, maybe 6 or 7 cities? And each one is relatively small, having maybe 6 or 7 areas that you can go into. And the areas are not exactly huge. The parks and the sewers are usually not more than a few screens each. If you get low on health, you can go visit Watson here. He'll refill your health for free. Otherwise, you have to go to a shop and buy a health refill item. I actually have it there in my inventory. It's the green bottle with the blue liquid. You'll need a lot of money in this game, mostly because the travel tickets for the train are so expensive. You have a maximum of, I think it is $999 you can carry in this game. Some of the train tickets cost almost that each way, so you'll often go to a city, do what you need to do, and then go around killing some more people and get some more money. At every city there's often a little criminal headquarters you can visit. You'll need to put in the correct password, otherwise they'll steal some of your money, you'll lose a lot of health, and you get kicked back out on the street. Another thing you'll find in cities is shops, where you can buy various important items, such as weapons, keys, lamps for lighting up dark rooms, that sort of thing. This shop also sells tobacco. As you can see, the health refills are quite expensive. And really, you'll spend a good chunk of this game simply walking around killing pedestrians. Oddly enough, unlike in Grand Theft Auto, the police don't really seem to mind. This knife here is not very useful for pedestrians. Your kick is much more powerful, but even better is when you can eventually get a gun. Once you have that, you'll be able to clear through pedestrians quite quickly. And there are also these various bad guys that pop up the sewers and whatnot. One rather amusing thing about this game is it certainly depicts British cities of the time as being very dangerous. Here in Edinburgh, people walk around the streets randomly firing off guns. Another thing, this game is actually pretty hard. You have very little life and can take maybe 2 shots before dying. Inside buildings in particular, it's very easy to get hit since enemies are running around very quickly and firing guns all over the place, and you can't really duck. One more unusual feature is that you can gamble in this game, something else ripped off directly from Zelda. Later it seems gambling would become pretty common in RPGs, but it really wasn't frequently seen at this time. And once you've gotten through all the various mini-bosses here, you'll end up in this castle. This is actually a rather large maze-like castle filled with the usual henchmen. Once you find the hidden door that allows you access to the final boss, you'll be able to pick him off in a few shots. He's actually pretty easy as long as you don't let him hit you. If you can fire off some shots before he rushes at you, you'll be able to kill him very quickly. Otherwise, he'll kill you instantly. Like a lot of games at this time, the developers of Sherlock Holmes, whoever they might be, this game was published by Takeshi, not a very well-known Japanese publisher. I don't know who actually developed the game. Takeshi was later known for the Garfield game for the Famicom. But for some reason they felt the need to hide almost all the important items in the game. Here's the final boss right here. Let's try that again. And he takes only a few shots to go down. I guess he's saying that he never gives up, not that he's encouraging you to not give up. As I mentioned, Sherlock Holmes is sort of an odd little game. In some ways it's ahead of its time. The way you can travel around from city to city in a non-linear fashion, and have to pay money for the privilege, the use of gambling. In a lot of ways, however, it's a pretty much unplayable relic of its era. Your character handles very badly, and the aspect of running around looking for various clues hidden in random spots is certainly not very appealing. Oh boy, from Hudson Soft, it's Doreamon. This game is based on the enormously popular Japanese manga and TV series, which is about a robotic cat that travels back in time in order to help a little Japanese boy. So Doreamon is very much like the Terminator, only instead of trying to kill the kid, he's trying to be nice to him. The Doreamon cartoon TV show started in the late 70s, I think, and ran for years and years and years. It was certainly still on when this video game came out. And of course there was massive amounts of licensed Doreamon junk as well, including this game, which really isn't that hot for a Hudson game. So you're dropped off in the city here, and the first thing you need to do is find a weapon. That thing I just grabbed there was actually a health refill. The first thing you get looks kind of like a glue gun, but at least it allows you to shoot your enemies. This first part of the game is vaguely Zelda-like. You wander around in a top-down view, occasionally dropping into tunnels and finding little doors. You'll need to find various items, such as weapons power-ups, things that will refill your life, and so on and so forth. As you can see, your first weapon here is very weak, so right away we can find a power-up. And apparently this era was sort of the golden age of video games where pretty much every single thing in the game is hidden. That's right, almost every single item you need to find is hidden in some sort of secret manhole or secret door or something, so you have to go around randomly shooting things in order to find them. Here, for example, not only is the manhole hidden, but once you get inside, so is the power-up itself. While this concept of having everything hidden was obviously taken from Zelda and similar games, I really think it's over-reliant to sign of sort of like lazy game designers. They can really stretch out the length of the game simply by making it virtually impossible to find anything. I just found the candy there, which is something you need to collect to actually pass through this level. So in the first part of this game here, you sort of run around, shoot enemies, try to find various power-ups, try to find the candy, and eventually you'll find the secret exit. And this first world here is not incredibly large. I mean, compared to Zelda, the overworld is much smaller, and there's only a few manhole covers and whatnot to go into. Here you found the very unusual underground graveyard. And we're actually coming up to the first boss here. The gameplay in Doreamon is pretty simple, mostly just run around and shoot things. You don't really have any sort of ducking ability or anything like that, and your jumping is pretty limited, so it can sometimes be difficult to avoid getting shot. Well, here's the first boss. We just need to avoid his little projectiles there and occasionally jump up and shoot him a few times and he'll be taken care of. And really the first part of this game isn't that bad. It's only in the second part that it starts getting pretty horrible. I believe there are 3 parts altogether. Once you've taken care of him, you'll then move on to the next level, which is actually a really, really terrible shoot-'em-up level. And it's odd because Hudson had made good shoot-'em-ups, such as Star Soldier in the past, and would make obviously very good ones in the future, but this is really awful. I mean, quite frankly, you really sort of want to try to rush through these levels because you hate playing them so much. There are a few minimal power-ups you can get, like you can get one of the kids to sort of act as your wingman here, but really this part of the game is very unpleasant. So I can't really recommend Doreamon as a good game. First part's not so bad, it kind of gets worse from there, and it really is sort of below the level of work that Hudson was normally turning out. In the category of games you almost certainly won't like, it's Adian no Tsue, which means cane of Adian, or maybe staff of Adian. Right away on the title screen, notice the copyright notice from Ask Kodansha. We'll discuss that a little later. But when you open up this game, probably the first thing you'll notice is that it is a shockingly blatant ripoff of Zelda. Run around killing monsters, but there's one major difference. This is a math game. In order to collect the bells, you need to solve a very simple arithmetic problem. If you get the answer wrong, it will close the door and send some monsters in. If you get the right answer, you'll be able to collect the bell, which can be used to buy things later in the game. Now, Kodansha is a huge publisher of Japanese books, magazines, and manga. I believe they're actually the largest publishing house in Japan. I'm not sure what they really have to do with this game. I don't think it's based off an existing manga, and I can't really imagine Kodansha developing this game. Probably they co-published it with Sunsoft. Also, this game is subtitled Chino Series 1. We'll see a couple of other games in this series in future episodes. Getting the right answer makes you very happy, by the way. Unlike Zelda, there is no overworld, only these very small outdoors areas. Mostly, however, you're simply roaming around the rooms looking for the stairway to the next level. Once you get all the way up to the top, you'll presumably face some kind of boss. I have no idea. I certainly didn't play the game all the way through. This is a pretty simple game. There's really very little leveling up involved or anything like that. There is a shop that you can buy items using your bells. You don't actually find the shop, you can access it any time by hitting, I believe it is, your select button. This will also give you your stats as they are and tell you what floor they're on. Here's one of those little outdoor areas I mentioned. It looks kind of like Nazo no Murasami, actually. Oh, here's the screen where we can sort of choose different things to go to. Here's the shopkeeper. There's also a lady who gives you advice. This game is pretty easy. The monsters aren't that difficult. Certainly a lot easier to figure out than Zelda. There's really no puzzles in it, as far as I can tell. And there are frequent items that will refill your health. So really, Adian no Tsue is an incredibly minor title from Sunsoft, a company which has produced a lot of minor titles so far, and pretty much completely forgettable once you get over the weird concept of combining Zelda dungeons with a math game. Oh, I found the staircase there. And now I'll go from level 1 to level 2. Which is exactly the same as the first level. It's another FDS game with a rather lame title screen. Nazo no Kabe, Block Kuzushi by Konami. That name means Riddle of the Wall, Block Destruction. Oddly, this game was actually released in Europe in 1991 under the name Crackout, but never in the US. Nazo no Kabe is a cool little game, but it definitely cannot be called original, since it's a pretty blatant clone of Taito's Arkanoid, and actually managed to beat Arkanoid to the Famicom by around a week. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the basic style of this game, the premise goes all the way back to the 1976 Atari arcade game Breakout. Here's the classic Atari 2600 version of the game. Breakout is sort of like a single-player version of Pong. The idea is simply to hit the ball with your paddle and destroy the wall of bricks. In 1986, Taito revived this idea with their big arcade hit Arkanoid. Added such enhancements such as power-ups and enemies that fly across the screen. And Nazo no Kabe is sort of an enhanced version of Arkanoid. It adds more complicated brick structures and more enemies to destroy, and as well as additional power-ups, such as that Castlevania-like stopwatch there. In fact, even Konami Man himself makes an appearance. If you catch him, it'll let you move on to the next level without destroying all the blocks. There we go. Note the odd little Puyo Puyo-like enemy floating around in this level. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. At any rate, all these additional elements actually make this game pretty fun. I think I probably like it more than Arkanoid, actually. Even add stationary bosses that you need to destroy. There's actually only one boss in Arkanoid on the very last level. And this game has them scattered throughout the game. These things usually take quite a few hits to destroy. And one thing that Nazo no Kabe does, it has added some additional power-ups to the game. Some of them are copied right out of Arkanoid, but there are other ones as well. Note this sort of science fiction theme here. Again, that's copied straight out of Arkanoid. Breakout didn't really have any particular theme to it, whereas Arkanoid added sort of like spaceships and aliens and whatnot to the whole Breakout idea. Some of the power-ups, there's the one that makes your paddle extra long. There's also the power-up that gives you 2 balls in the air at once. Just like in Arkanoid, there are blocks that take multiple hits to break. Now there is one major problem with Nazo no Kabe, and that's the controls. Traditionally these games use a rotary paddle for fast, accurate control, and the D-pad simply doesn't work quite as well. You can't fly across the screen in order to stop an out-of-control ball the way you can with a rotary paddle. Konami has compensated by giving the game less horizontal space. But the bottom line is that Breakout clones really work best with a rotary paddle. Regardless, this game is a lot of fun, and I would highly recommend it. I think I like it a little better than Arkanoid itself. And this is yet another FDS game, and is from our good buddy Square. Or rather, it was developed by Square and published by Square's new subsidiary, DOG, Disc Original Group. DOG was sort of a consortium of various small developers and was created specifically to release games on the FDS. We'll see a number of DOG titles released, but most of them, like this game, really aren't very good. Suishou no Ryuu is a text adventure game, one of the earliest text adventure games on the Famicom, but it's really closer to Dead Zone than to Portopia. There is some sort of plot to Suishou no Ryuu, but it's difficult to ascertain what exactly is going on by playing the game. By the way, we're actually going to be looking at an unofficial English translation here. This game, of course, was never released outside of Japan. I can only assume the Japanese game came with some sort of detailed instruction book that laid out all the characters and the backstory. Sort of starts out suddenly with your main character running into a mysterious space dragon and then a mysterious green-haired woman named Jean. You'll soon find yourself back on your planet, but there isn't really that much exploration you can do. From the main screen with the news broadcast, you can move a couple screens in each direction, and usually there's somebody waiting for you at the end of each direction. And occasionally other characters will pop up, but they really aren't introduced, so very little of what actually happens in the game makes sense. Apparently, people are disappearing and you have to find them. Now, as you may have noticed, this game doesn't use text commands like Portopia or Dead Zone did, but rather little icons for, well, let's see, there's move, look, pick up, talk, use, open door, etc., etc. There's actually really not very much dialogue. You do have limited interaction with other people at several points. But most of the game is stuff like this. How do you open the door? Well, pick out your revolver and shoot off the lock. Then go inside the door. What do you do then? Well, look around inside the single room until you notice there's a false panel. Then open it and touch the computer. Then you'll get some kind of plot point that appears. Actually, this section right here is one of the very few sections where you can actually lose the game. Jean will appear and try to shoot you if you don't shoot her first. So you can't actually die in this section. Most of the time, though, you spend most of the game just sort of running here, going there, opening this door, using this particular item at a particular spot, etc., etc. But this game is a long way from Enix's Portopia with its large cast of characters and interesting red herrings and dead ends and leads that take you to new areas and so on and so forth. Now, there are actually several locales in this game. For example, your home planet, you fly around in space on what is apparently some sort of space scooter, and you actually have to go to a couple other planets, neither of which are very interesting. At various points you collect certain items, or you have items given to you that pretty much usually only have one use, maybe two. This game does occasionally get a bit frustrating. Some parts, like on your home planet, are extremely easy to navigate. In other cases, like when you're in outer space, you just sort of wander around randomly until you run into a planet. Oh yes, and here you get 999 credits, even though I don't see how you can actually use them, so what's the point? So eventually you go to this one planet, find this mysterious pyramid, use your magnetic key to get inside, then you wander around until you find a computer. Eventually you'll find some sort of glowing crystal orb. I suppose one thing that's interesting about this game is the appearance of this crystal orb. Of course, the early Final Fantasy games would make use of something very similar. Oh, one other thing, you may have noticed on the title screen that there is a copyright of character design to Nippon Sunrise. That's a Japanese animation studio. Apparently this is not based on an anime or a manga, but rather the characters were designed by this animation studio. In particular, they were the work of one Hazumi Sato. And one other thing that's sort of unusual about this game is that when it came out, apparently it got a certain amount of notoriety in Japan due to some sort of rumor that there's a way to make the heroine, Cynthia, we saw just a second ago, appear nude. Apparently doctored video game screenshots appeared in some magazine or something. This sounds like some intriguing early version of hot coffee, but no, apparently it's actually a completely false rumor and there's no way to actually do that. Well, at this point in the game you finally meet the mastermind behind all the kidnappings, and you defeat him by throwing the crystal at him. And then guess what? You've beat the game. Well, this game is certainly not that great, and I guess is sort of typical of the kind of shoddy product, or at least uninspired product that Square was putting out at this time. I'm not really sure how to classify this game breeder. It's not so bad that it's Kasuge, but it's certainly not any good either. Probably the best thing about it is the very cool Roger Dean style logo. Oh yeah, and make sure you pay attention to this title intro here because it's the most exciting thing that happens in the entire game. Seriously, that's more action right there than will actually occur the entire time you play this thing. This was released by SoftPro, and you might remember SoftPro being the same guys that released the Famicom port of Karateka. They were certainly not a major publisher. They released only a handful of titles, mostly on the Famicom system, and they seem to specialize in sort of strategy simulation type games. And that's more or less what Breeder is. It's sort of a robot creation / robot fighting simulation game. And the important thing to realize about this is you create robots and they fight, but you don't actually control the fighting itself. So the game loads up here, and the first thing you'll want to do is actually maybe make some metal soldiers, as they call them. And this is pretty much the only interactive part of the game. You can start by giving your guy a name. You can have 7 guys in your roster. Go ahead, put in a name, and once you've taken care of that, then you'll need to actually sort of add the attributes. And this looks rather RPG-ish here. You've got things like dexterity and IQ. Not really sure what all of these do, like what's the difference between IQ and mind, for example. Go ahead and put in your qualities, select what kind of body you want, how many legs, wheels, etc. This is type snake. And go ahead and have them fight. Now the more sort of qualities you put on there, the more it costs, and how much it costs will actually affect how much fuel you use while fighting. And now you're ready to go. These are 2 sort of basic guys here. The blue guy is actually the strong one. The pink one is just the default. Everything's set to 0. And once again, remember, you're not actually doing anything. You're just watching this. And probably right away you'll realize, hey, this is not exciting. They're not doing anything. They just sort of wander around randomly and occasionally hit each other. We're almost to the thrilling conclusion of the fight here. In real time, these take quite a while, maybe 5 minutes a fight. Ah, there we go. Hope that was worth it. Not really sure who this game was aimed for. I mean, in theory, it might be interesting to be able to sort of fool around with different attributes and see, you know, how a robot with intelligence would do against a robot with like high armor or something, but the actual fighting sequences are so long, slow, and boring. I mean, this moves very, very slowly. They very rarely actually fight, and half the time it's whoever runs out of fuel quickest will lose. For example, here, Blue has his stats pumped way up, but he's using a lot of fuel, and he never really makes even much contact with the pink guy. Eventually, Blue will lose simply by running out of fuel. So unfortunately, the execution of this game is so bad that it really falls into the category of games you would not want to touch with a 10-foot pole. At last, we come to what is probably the second most infamous game in this episode, right behind Takeshi no Chousenjou, namely Mashou, or Deadly Towers, as it was renamed in the US. Mashou was developed by Linar, who are also behind Bird Week, and published by Irem, or by Broderbund in the US. The US release of this game was not well loved, to say the least. Deadly Towers is not known for being a good game, but it became quite notorious, mostly because of the internet pop culture commentator Sean Baby listing it as the worst NES game of all time. It's not really that bad, but it certainly isn't very good. Now, Mashou means Evil Bell, and the plot, which was detailed in that lengthy title screen scroll earlier, involves young Prince Meyer climbing 7 towers in order to collect a bell at each one. At this point, the bells must be burned in order to access the evil Lubus's lair. Deadly Towers plays like a twisted evil version of Zelda. You go around fighting monsters that drop health refills and money, you can buy things, and find heart containers that increase your life bar. A note to future video game designers, the third monster you face in the game shouldn't take like 20 hits to kill. Now, just like Zelda, Deadly Towers has an overworld of sorts, this castle that you start off in, but it's relatively small. You progress through it vertically, and there's only around 8 or so vertical levels, each level being a few screens wide. The top level of the castle is the room where the flame used to burn the bells, as well as the entrances to the towers themselves. Of course, you can't go there directly because the way is blocked. Now this is where the game gets cruel. This area that I'm in right now is actually the dungeons. There are 10 dungeons in Deadly Towers, all of which have hidden entrances. You can't make the entrance visible, but rather you will unexpectedly be transported to the dungeon simply by stepping on the square where the entrance is found. Once you're in the dungeon, you can't just leave, you actually have to find the exit. As you can see, every room of the dungeon is pretty nondescript. They certainly didn't put a lot of effort into designing the dungeons. All the shops are found in the dungeons. Here I want to buy those boots that will make me walk a little faster, but unfortunately I don't have nearly enough money yet. Now the thing about the dungeons is that each one consists of around 100 to 200 interconnected, virtually identical rooms, each filled with monsters, some of which will kill you instantly upon entering the room. So when you suddenly find yourself inside of a dungeon, there's no way of really knowing where you are or where the exit is. Furthermore, you actually have to navigate through the dungeons in order to find the shops, in order to get the key to get past the roadblock. The shops sell different items, so it's going to be quite difficult to have to navigate through the, 1,500 to 2,000 dungeon rooms in order to find what you're looking for. Here I've gotten through the dungeons and I'm back in the castle at the room where the flame is, and those are actually the entrances to the towers right there. Once you get to the entrance to the towers themselves, you'll find they're actually pretty simple. Essentially, you just go up 10 flights of stairs to the entrance to the actual tower, then 10 more flights up connected by ladders to the boss. Most of the bosses are actually pretty easy. Additionally, a number of very important items are found in the towers, but they're almost all hidden, requiring you to find a hidden teleportation square in order to get to them. The game itself will be extremely difficult without these helpful armor and weapons hidden in the towers. This right here is one of the towers. Those little guys in devil suits look pretty badass, but actually they're not very tough at all. They're a lot easier to kill than those little blue blobs floating around. And there really aren't a whole lot of enemies in the towers. Some of the floors don't have any enemies at all. The hidden items I mentioned are basically found by sort of wandering around on the floor until you suddenly step on the magic square that'll take you to the room where the hidden armor or weapon is. Here's one of the bosses right here. Most of the bosses can be spammed simply by standing in a corner and shooting some knives diagonally at them. All the bosses have more or less the same attack pattern. And all the towers are very, very similar. This guy looks pretty tough, but is actually a piece of cake. By this time I've gotten some additional weapons and items that allow me to throw much more powerful swords at a much faster rate. All of this underlies the main problem of the game, that upon beginning it, your character is extremely slow and underpowered. Trying to navigate around the castle and dungeons will get you lost, probably permanently, and most folks will actually never make it to the towers themselves. Trying to find your way around the dungeons is absurdly hard unless you have a map. However, it's not really that hard once you've gotten to the towers. Once you've collected the bell, you'll then go ahead and drop it into the fire. This will magically replenish your health. So basically you just do this for all 7 towers, continue to collect more special items, and once you've got all 7 of the bells, the door to Rubus's lair will open up. Unless, of course, you happen to accidentally step into a teleportation square and get stuck in a dungeon like I just did here. Now, of course, I have to find my way out of the thing again. And I have no idea where I am. So here's the final climb right here. Not really too bad, and once you get to Rubus, you'll find he's almost certainly the most difficult boss of the game. However, for the most part, Deadly Towers is horrifically unbalanced. The only really difficult part in the second half of the game is fighting Rubus himself. Add in some wonky controls and the fact that being hit by an enemy will often cause you to slide down the screen off a cliff, and you get a game that a lot of people really hate. The trick to Rubus is to stand in between him and those little dragon heads floating around him and slowly make your way to the right hand side of the screen, then start hitting him with your sword. And at this point you get a weird ending. What are those little things flying down? I actually thought I had done something wrong. But no, suddenly it's raining little, well, I really can't say what those are supposed to be. Well, it must be a good thing because you've now finished the game. So, there we have Deadly Towers. No, it's not a good game, but it's not nearly as bad as you might think. I guess it's sort of the apotheosis of the idea that things in video games should be hidden, a la Zelda. Everything in this game is hidden. The dungeons, the entrances, virtually all the important items, the shops. It's all been taken to such an extreme that the game is very difficult to play. Though I guess it's still better than the Takeshi Kitano game. Here's a game we'll have to file under just plain weird, Namco's Metro Cross. It's a port of their 1985 arcade game, and was eventually ported to a number of computer systems, as well as this Japan-only Famicom version. If you examine the cover, you'll notice you are jumping over what are inarguably oversized Coca-Cola cans. You'll also encounter normal-sized blue soda cans in the game itself. Exactly what this means, I'm really not sure. The object of the game is to run through this obstacle course before the timer runs out, jumping over objects and avoiding patches in the floor that will kill you or slow you down. You sometimes find helpful items such as springboards or skateboards. If you don't beat the timer, you are electrocuted. This game obviously takes place in some sort of dystopian future world where citizens are forced to participate in deadly sporting events for the amusement of their corporate overlords. And for added humiliation, they apparently have to do this while naked. Yeah, your character is definitely not wearing any clothes in this game, even though on the cover he seems to be wearing some sort of outfit. It's all very disturbing. As for the game itself, well, I guess it's entertaining for a little while, though it's hardly a classic. On the third level, which has all the springboards, I found it pretty difficult to actually jump over them correctly. More than anything else, I found myself wondering, what's all this obsession with soda going on here? This game might be some sort of political comment, I'm really not sure. So on Metro Cross, I'll definitely say give this one a try for an unusual and not very well known game. Once little sparks go flying there, you're about to get electrocuted. Well, I guess it doesn't really kill him. Yeah, so Metro Cross, strange game, definitely worth a look. Well, this would almost certainly be considered to be the best game we're going to see this episode. King Kong 2, Ikari no Megaton Punch, and it starts out with a really great introductory cutscene here. Yeah, it looks like King Kong misses his girlfriend and is about to go on a rampage. That's the plot of the game. Now, if you're wondering, what is this about King Kong 2? Was there a King Kong 1 game? No, this is actually based on the 1986 film, King Kong Lives, which was known as King Kong 2 in Japan. King Kong Lives was the sequel to the 1976 Dino De Laurentiis remake of King Kong, and just like that earlier King Kong movie, King Kong Lives was really not very good. There really weren't a lot of video games based on films at this time, so why did this particular movie get made into a game? Who knows? You control Kong, and you can jump and punch. And as you collect rocks, you can also throw rocks. There are various power-ups throughout the game. For example, that little potion there will increase your speed slightly. You'll also find life bar increases, power-ups that will increase the strength of your rocks, and will increase your rock carrying capacity. The game is played on a series of interlinked screens here, as you can see. Sort of like a game like Pitfall, only it's vertical instead of horizontal. The screens are mostly relatively linear. Occasionally you'll come across a screen with more than one way to go, but for the most part you just sort of walk in one direction, usually up, occasionally from side to side. Some of the later levels are a bit more maze-like in the sense that you can often go in multiple directions and sometimes you can't get to one screen from a certain direction. That little star there is an invincibility star. So I think if you've played games at all like this, you'll probably pick this one up pretty quickly. Mostly jump around, smash things, kill enemies, grab the various items they leave behind, avoid things like the tanks that spew flame. Now that little door right there is where we can get one of our first power-ups. It's an artificial heart. In the King Kong Lives movie, King Kong somehow survived his fall off the building, was given a new heart, and then met a female King Kong and fell in love. And that's sort of what this game is about. You're looking for your girlfriend. Now I mentioned the levels were linear, and that's really not quite true. Scattered throughout the game are these little doors that will often warp you to either another part of the level or to another level entirely. Here, for example, I was just transported to another screen in the same level. Most levels are around 20-25 screens long. There's a boss in each level, and there's 9 levels altogether. So while this game is physically not very large, most of the environment can be destroyed either by smashing with your fist or by jumping on it, and a lot of time is spent around smashing things, looking for all the various hidden items. For example, on that little boat right there, I'll find the hidden door that'll take me to this boss, which is a giant clam that shoots fireballs. And there's certainly, I mean, this game is inspired only very, very loosely on the movie. This really bears no resemblance to the film at all. So once you defeat the boss, you get a key. Once you have all 8 keys, you can then go to the last level and free your girlfriend. And the fact that there are all these little sort of hidden doors, hidden warps, makes the game somewhat confusing to get around in. You probably want to take notes or draw a map as you're playing this game, otherwise you'll really have a hard time finding your way around it, with so many levels composed of sort of very similar looking screens. There's another warp right there, and I'm taken to someplace else in the same level. Coming up here is one of the weirdest levels in the whole game. It takes place during a city, but for some reason it's infested with giant red fireball shooting ducks. Again, I'm pretty sure there is nothing even remotely like this in the film itself. Well, is this game any good or not? Yeah, it is pretty good. This is a typical quality title from Konami. I'd say it's probably the best game in this episode. Doesn't quite stack up next to something like Castlevania, but it's certainly pretty fun playable. Nice environments. It is pretty satisfying getting to smash things, and whenever you jump there is a rather nice, chunky kind of screen-shaking thump as you land. Some of the enemies can be a bit annoying, like the fact that they're constantly shooting missiles at you. If you don't like exploration-type games where everything is hidden from plain view, you might not like this. But I will admit it is pretty fun jumping around smashing stuff up. One thing that makes this game kind of charming is just the fact that it's so damn weird. What exactly are all those ducks doing, and what are all these things anyway? What does this really have anything to do with King Kong? Well, I guess it doesn't really matter because the game is fun to play, and I'd say definitely give it a try, even though it's hardly the best game that Konami made around this time. Released the same day as King Kong 2 was the Sunsoft title Wing of Madoola, sometimes called Madoola no Tsubasa or even Madara no Tsubasa. And like a few other recent titles, such as Gall Force, Space Hunter, and Metroid, your character is female. Madoola is actually a rather unique inversion of the traditional video game plot. Your character, Lucia, is trying to rescue a prince. Madoola is a side-scrolling platformer, albeit one without much real platforming. Lucia is armed, so you might compare this to earlier Sunsoft platformers such as Tokaido Goshu Sanchi or Atlantis no Nazo, and it might even remind you of a little Castlevania, even though Castlevania was still a pretty new game when this came out. One addition to the standard side-scrolling platformer formula is that Madoola has some light RPG, Zelda, Metroid-esque elements thrown in, through the introduction of a steady stream of power-ups you collect. In every level, you find a couple items that will improve your abilities, such as boots that allow you to jump higher, and consecutively more powerful swords, and even magic spells. Lucia also has hit points and magic points. Now this is the first boss, some sort of guy inside an eggshell. Much like Castlevania, after you defeat him you can then collect a health refill. There it is right there. Now one thing about Madoola, the enemies are hard to kill even at early levels. For example, in level 2 you'll come across all these little purple blobs that tend to surround you in groups, but they take multiple hits to kill. There's really no way you can take them on, so you'll need to try to outrun them. This is actually true of a lot of enemies in the game, so much so that you'll eventually end up usually jumping over enemies or just trying to avoid them, rather than actually engaging them in combat. You see here just how much trouble these purple blobs give you. Also, enemies often come at you at very strange angles, and sometimes very quickly, so it's difficult to actually fight the enemies without taking damage. I don't know about you, but I don't really like this in a game. It seems to me that when I spend the entire level sort of trying to run and jump over all the enemies, it doesn't really seem like I'm actually playing the game, but rather I'm just sort of rushing through the levels. Here's something I don't really get. It looks like a boss level with no boss in it. I guess it's just an empty room. Now all of that said, this game actually looks pretty decent. There's quite a bit of variety in the levels, like you've started overground and then moved into these underground caverns, and then you sort of get a lot of variety in this game. Madoola is probably the closest thing to a good game that Sunsoft has come out with so far. Of course, considering some previous titles were Super Arabian and Atlantis no Nazo, maybe that's not really saying much. But this definitely shows Sunsoft moving in the right direction. As we can see, collecting that energy refill there doesn't actually refill your hit points entirely, only partially. Now, Madoola definitely has some problems. I've already mentioned that most of the enemies are a little hard to kill, and also the controls are not quite right. Definitely better than Atlantis no Nazo, but the platform parts are still quite a bit of pain. If anyone ever complains about the controls for attacking and jumping in the first Castlevania game, have them play this game. That will give them some perspective. Trying to jump on these things is really not a lot of fun. So, all in all, Madoola, a great game? No, definitely not. An improvement over previous Sunsoft titles? Absolutely. The last two games this episode are both FDS games, and both released December 19th. First up, we'll do Deep Dungeon. It sounds like an S&M porn title, but is actually an old school RPG developed by Hummingbird Soft. Also, it's the second release on Square's new FDS imprint, DOG. Hummingbird Soft actually started out as a real estate company before moving into video games in the early 80s. They released titles on a few different systems before disappearing altogether in the mid-90s. I believe there were a total of 4 Deep Dungeon games. Now, according to this title scroll, and we're looking at an unofficial English translation, once again, there's a missing princess. The plot here seems somewhat similar to the beginning of Dragon Warrior, but Deep Dungeon doesn't actually take its inspiration from that game, but rather from much earlier US RPGs like Wizardry. Now, there is an inn and stores where you can buy weapons, magic, and supplies, but there's really no outside world in this game, no mountains and forests and towns and that sort of thing. In true dungeon crawler fashion, everything takes place inside the dungeon. You basically start out at the top of the dungeon, and your goal is to get to the bottom of the dungeon, that's the 8th floor, and then kill the main bad guy. As usual, the cheap-ass king gives you a measly 200 gold pieces so you can buy a simple weapon. Then you descend and you're in the dungeon. How this game is played is you enter the dungeon, killing monsters, collecting gold, and earning experience, while occasionally heading back up to rest at the end and spend your money. Then head back down and explore a little bit deeper. Later you will actually find shops inside the dungeon itself. Once you get enough experience, you'll level up, and your hit points will increase. You also have attack, that's AP, and defense, that's AC, but as far as I can tell, those can only be increased by buying weapons and armor. In the dungeons, aside from monsters and treasure, you'll occasionally encounter an NPC, usually a helpful, friendly warrior that you can talk to who will give you a little hint, and occasionally you'll find a message. One rather interesting thing about this game is it seems that most of your money comes from these little piles of trash that are scattered all over the place. Every time you come across one, you examine it, and it contains either gold or a monster, or maybe even both. You can kill the monsters for experience, and obviously the gold you can keep. Oddly enough, when you re-enter a level, the trash will be restocked, so you can check them again. Deep Dungeon is probably the only RPG where you spend a considerable amount of time rummaging through piles of garbage. As you may have noticed, this dungeon is pretty nondescript. You have no in-game map, at least not immediately. You can actually buy one a little bit later in the game, so you'll probably need to draw a map. In fact, the main challenge of the game seems to be finding your way around the dungeon. Something else is a little different from Dragon Warrior about this game is you don't really seem to encounter very many random monsters. They mostly exist in preset locations like this thief here, who is always in this little room, or in piles of trash. So wandering around the dungeons, you actually very rarely just encounter random monsters. This can sometimes make your experience a bit hard to collect. That's why you're often going back to the piles of trash. You'll see me level up here in just a second. A charming little heroic level up theme plays. Okay, after I finish off this skeleton, I get 5 experience points, taking me up to, I guess, 60, and then I'm in the 3rd level. As you may have noticed, it doesn't actually increase your attack power or your defense. So what are the good and bad points about this game? Well, I guess the good points is it was rather ambitious for Hummingbird Soft to attempt a game like this. This is actually the very first-person RPG released on the Famicom. Well, there actually really haven't been that many RPGs at all. On the negative side, this game really isn't that great. I mean, consider that this was based on games that were already around 6 or 7 years old when this came out. Games like Wizardry. So this is pretty old-fashioned, even though obviously the graphics are much better than you would see on those old Apple games. So I've taken a moment to go back to the inn and rest. This will replenish your health and whatnot. Also, buying bread will replenish your health, and water will, oddly enough, cure you of the poison status. The game is pretty small in terms of the amount of items and magic available. I believe there's around maybe 8 weapons in the game altogether. I think 6 different types of magic. Magic is actually purchased at a store. And the combat is also slightly frustrating. It seems to be completely randomized. Sometimes very minor enemies will deal out huge amounts of damage, and enemies tend to dodge an awful lot. And this game is quite frankly pretty boring and repetitive. The lack of any sort of real plot or characterization or anything like that makes the game sort of on the dull side. Sadly, we have now reached the last game this episode, Nightlore, published by Jalico and licensed from Rare? Yes, this is a Rare game, and we'll discuss that in just a moment, but first, check out this awesomely terrible introduction screen. My god, those flashing rectangles. It's like something you would program in 10 minutes back on an old Apple II. Okay, so this is actually a port of Rare's 1984 computer game, originally released for the British computers the ZX Spectrum. This is an FDS game, so you can create a profile and save your game. Back then, English developers traditionally had really awful names, and Rare was no exception. Back in 1984, they called themselves Ultimate Play the Game for some reason. By the time this game came out for the Famicom, they had changed their name to Rare. Nightlore, like a lot of old Spectrum games, is very fondly remembered by fans of the system and highly regarded in those circles, and like a lot of Spectrum games, it's actually pretty terrible. You play this little elf. Well, actually, in the original computer version, he was more like an explorer guy, with a pith helmet or something. But you play this little elf who suffers from lycanthropy and turns into a werewolf about every 30 seconds. You can see the little night and day cycle thing running in the corner there. So you roam around the world, avoiding traps and collecting items, eventually putting them to a magic pot to obtain a cure. Now, back when the Spectrum version first came out, this game was considered to be pretty pioneering. It was one of the first video games, or rather one of the first home video games, to use isometric perspective. You'll probably remember that in arcade games like Q*bert or Congo Bongo. Today the game just seems sort of boring and pointless from a gameplay perspective. This Famicom port looks substantially different than the original Spectrum version. The characters and levels have all been reworked, apparently by Jellicoe themselves. Trying to move around using the D-pad is really an exercise in frustration. Still, the transformation animation is pretty amusing. Nevertheless, Nightlore hasn't really stood the test of time very well. So, sorry to end this episode on sort of a disappointing note, but next episode we'll be seeing some rather more interesting games. So that's it for this episode, and we're almost done with 1986, only 10 more days left in the year. Definitely tune in next episode when we'll introduce the year of 1987, plus not one, but two major releases from Nintendo.